Fala galera, boa noite, estava montado aqui, já resolvi. André Rufino aqui. Vamos começar aqui o programa número 1 aqui do Rufus Show. Hoje a gente vai conversar aí com uma figura muito incrível aí do movimento libertário americano, né? O Mexican American, Zach Foster. Ex-militar, né? Ex-mercenário também, já foi. E trabalha, né, com ativismo libertário diretamente lá nos Estados Unidos, faz um trabalho até parecido com o meu, né, gosto bastante do trabalho que ele faz, é um parceiro internacional do Liber, e vamos conversar com o Zach aí agora, certo? Hey Zach, good night man, how are you doing?
Hello Rufus, greetings from beautiful Hollywood in Southern California. I'm glad to be with you.
Nice man, nice to have you here. And let's talk about freedom, right? Our fight against communism, Marxism, statism. And first, introduce yourself, talk about a little bit of you, what are you doing, what's your history, tell us.
Alright, well my name is Zach Foster. I am ethnically Mexican American. I've been an activist in politics for probably 15-16 years at this point, and my libertarian activism has been closer to about 10 years. Originally I got involved in libertarianism through the Ron Paul campaign. For anybody who might not be familiar with him, Ron Paul was a Republican congressman for Texas for several decades, but distinct among the congressmen, he was the one that they called the libertarian, and he was always talking about those philosophies. And,
Ron Paul is my hero.
The microphone on the House floor. Whenever he would get the microphone on the House floor, he would be talking about how government should be doing this and shouldn't be doing that, and this ultimately hurts people. So I was very excited when this gentleman was running for president. One of the reasons I especially liked him is because he was the only Republican at the time who was anti-war. Well, I shouldn't say anti-war, he was pro-just war, but he was also very brave in pointing out that the wars my country was fighting at that time were not just wars. They were not wars that served our national security. So I volunteered very militantly for his campaign. I was a Republican from my 18th birthday.
So that's how you became a libertarian? With Ron Paul?
Through Ron Paul, yeah. And of course I read his books and got deeper into his philosophy, and it was through his books and articles that I came to find out the Ludwig von Mises Institute, which back in that particular era was putting out some really high quality economic materials on Austro-libertarianism. And it was a fantastic journey, but I was originally a member of the Republican Party from the time I turned 18 until I was 24 or 25 years old. And the number one thing that really made me leave Republicanism or conservatism is that most of the conservatives in my country were not the same type of conservative that we saw in people like Ron Paul, Robert Taft, Milton Friedman, some of the early heroes of classical liberal thought from the early 20th century United States.
They're more like neocons, right?
Different neocons, exactly. And one of the things that specifically made me sick was they really found every excuse to be in all these unconstitutional wars that we were in that were not serving our national security purposes, because they had been so hyped up by propaganda that they saw on TV that they said, no, our civilization is in a war against Islam, and that's why we have to be in 8 different wars at the same time, which was absolutely absurd, because how can our civilization be at war with Islam when my government created the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, which is the current Afghan? How can my civilization be at war against Islam when we have not just overthrown governments in the Middle East, but created new governments in the Middle East?
Libertarians are the true anti-war ideology, right?
Yeah, so a lot of these, so also every time that the government spent bigger, we noticed that even when Republicans were president, the national debt kept growing, and these were all things that Ron Paul talked about. and criticized from inside the Republican Party. So many of us libertarians in the United States, we also believe that we could criticize and reform the right from inside the Republican Party. So I stayed around in the Republican Party for a couple more years. And by 2014, the end of 2013, I figured out these people are not going to change. Not only are they not going to change, they were very hostile towards us. When it was time for the nomination process in 2012, for example, the Republican National Committee, the executive committee, like the council of people in charge of the entire Republican Party, decided that they were going to take away the credentials from a bunch of the Ron Paul delegates from several states and give those credentials to delegates for another Republican candidate.
Right.
So even these people showed that, these neocons showed that they are perfectly happy to act like the communists if it serves their purposes. So that was one of the things that turned me off, and it pushed me towards the Libertarian Party, because there were people in the Libertarian Party who were denouncing communism on a daily basis, but they were also denouncing the Democrats in the United States, and they were also denouncing the Republicans. And frankly, the Republicans needed to be denounced. So I joined the Libertarian Party, and that's been my party where I stayed active for probably 7 years now, at the very least.
That's really nice.
So
man.
my bridge to libertarianism was from the right, but I figured out the part of leftism, or the part of liberalism that appears to people on the left, libertarians are better at that than the left. And the parts of the right that appeal to conservatives, libertarians are better at conservatism than the right.
Right.
And once I learned these things, I knew for a fact that these were my people.
Nice. Can you speak a little bit louder, because you are already at max level here, and people are not. You're a little bit quiet, but it's okay. It's working anyway. Nice, man. You have a nice history with libertarianism. 7 years in the Libertarian Party. I am a big fan of Ron Paul. I used to help him. From Brazil, right? We have the page Libertarians for Ron Paul 2012, and we used to make a lot of campaign on the internet and defend Ron Paul on North American forums, and we really try our best to support Ron Paul from Brazil. But it was really a shame that the Republican Party, in my perspective, they frauded the system, so Ron Paul could not win the nomination. For me, it was fraud, 100% fraud, and that's the proof that the Republican Party was taken by the deep state, right, and the globalists. And they are not Marxists, but they work for the globalists, right? And the globalists, they develop and they work for Marxism all over the world. So Republicans, the neocons, the Bushs, right, and this faction of the Republicans.
I think very much like the communists, a lot of the people who get elected to office as Republicans, whether it's a government office inside the party, I feel like before they get elected to that office or appointed, they really do believe in their philosophy, because there's a lot of people, even from the Trump camp, who it seemed like in 2016 they would be really great people in government. And then even inside of that camp, it's like once they get into those positions and the power and the money starts going to their head, automatically it starts becoming about preserving the status quo for themselves, and everything that they promised to do, they immediately forget about. And that's one of the reasons why multiple members of the Trump administration actually went to prison. Like, while Donald Trump was president, people that he named to government were getting sent to prison. So I don't think it's just that the neocons or the globalists. I think it's once you get that power, you become a global.
Yeah, that's true, because you're gonna get blackmail, right? You're gonna get a lot of money, you're gonna sell out, and Yeah, globalists, they have their way, right? So let's talk about a little bit more about Latin America. For me, you are the best specialist in geopolitics of South America and Latin America that I know. You have a lot of knowledge about that. You have a military background too, and you work almost as a counterintelligence of the Cuban communists, right? So talk about a little bit about this involvement in counterintelligence of Cuba and Venezuela.
Well, let me start with how I got involved with anything having to do with Cuba and Venezuela in the first place. By the way, can you guys hear me all right?
Yeah. Guys, vocês estão ouvindo aí a voz dele? Como é que tá? Yeah, try to speak a little bit louder, but yeah, it's okay.
All right, well, I'll get a little bit closer to the microphone.
Yeah,
but
that would be better.
I got it turned up as high as it'll go.
Yeah.
All right, so I first got involved with Cuba 4 years ago. And originally I had nothing to do with that country. I'm not Cuban. I'm ethnically Mexican American. My father's family is white. My mother's family comes from northern Mexico. So I had nothing to do with these people. However, because I am Mexican, I speak Spanish. So I happened to be in some Spanish language forums early in 2017. And the reason why I was in a bunch of Spanish language libertarian forums on Facebook, at the last minute, a lot of people from my party chose not to support Gary Johnson. They were scared by the propaganda that Hillary Clinton was going to win, that at the last minute, even people from the Libertarian Party voted for Donald Trump and not for our candidate, Governor Johnson. So,
yeah, but that's a big problem, right? That's a big problem because if everyone, like, if a big part of the electorate votes for Libertarian and the Hillary wins because of this part, that would be problematic, no? Or that's a wrong assessment.
Trump won by such a large margin that it wouldn't have mattered against the final outcome if those libertarians had stayed faithful to their party.
Yeah.
It wasn't like the second time around. The second time around, I really do believe that he lost. But the first time, there is no question, he not only won, he kicked Hillary Clinton's ass. In 2016, Donald Trump kicked Hillary Clinton's ass at the voting, and he got it fair and square. And that's because she just assumed that the Democrats were going to get all these states. So she would go to the big city states, so like New York, Virginia, California, the states that have more people, but a lot of middle America, she just ignored them because they had worked for the Democrat Party used to be a lot more represented by working class people, like a lot more pickup trucks. There used to be a lot more people driving pickup trucks in the old Democratic Party. So yeah, a lot of middle America, a lot of rural places used to vote Democrat, but their culture has changed. So Donald Trump actually went to these places and he campaigned. And he shook hands, and he asked these people for their vote. So yeah, that is one of the main reasons why Donald Trump kicked Hillary Clinton's ass in 2016. And also, she was just a very unpopular candidate.
Yeah.
This time, yeah, so anyway, a lot of people from my party at the last minute, they jumped ship. And they voted for Donald Trump, even though we know in hindsight it would not have made a difference to the final outcome. He still would have been president. But if we had gotten 5% of the national vote, then automatically we qualify for the same federal funding for elections that the Democrats and Republicans get. And also funding for making our national convention, better access to the media, potential access to the debate stage. I mean, if we could just get somebody on the debate stage on TV one time, I guarantee you the Libertarian Party would start getting at least 20% of the votes, like immediately. The only reason we don't is because there actually is a conspiracy, an agreement by the Commission on Presidential Debates, which is literally controlled by a Democrat and by a Republican. And that's one of the things that makes it a nonpartisan institution, technically, is because it's written in the bylaws of the organization Like one co-president has to be a Republican, the other co-president has to be a Democrat. Well, about 30 years ago, they decided together that they were just going to never include any third parties on the stage. So it was always going to be only Republicans and Democrats on the debates for the presidential debates. 5% would have changed that. So I was very upset with the people from my party who jumped ship, and because of them, we got 4% instead of 5%.
Yeah.
C'est la vie. Anyway, because I was.
But it's a lot. It is a lot of people, anyways. Like.
Yeah. So I took my ball and I went home. So I was on Facebook talking with Spanish-speaking libertarians because I said, you know what? The hell with the gringo libertarians. I'm not talking to you until I'm ready. I'm just going to hang out and talk only with Spanish-speaking libertarians from Latin America. So that is how this random Cuban refugee in Miami found me on Facebook, and he starts blowing up my inbox talking about, help, help, help. I just got here to Miami, but I'm a libertarian, and my friends back in Havana, they're libertarians. 2 of my friends got arrested by state security for having the wrong books. I'm not asking for any money. Please just help me get this information to the world. And the more I talked with this guy, the more details he had, the more photos he had, information he was able to give us. And again, he was repeating himself, I don't want any money from you guys. Please, just get this information out so that the world knows about that. Well, I went and I found out because these guys really were libertarians. And I forgot what the exact book was. I could be mistaken, but I believe it was The Ethics of Liberty by Murray Rothbard, or Toward a New Liberty. It was one of those 2 books by Murray Rothbard, and that's why they got arrested by state security.
Right.
And the way that these Cuban libertarians got arrested was the shadiest way ever, because they got approached by these 2 guys.
By Cuban intelligence. Was Cuban intelligence that arrested?
Yes and no. Intelligence does very specific work, whereas state security
was more like
they
agents,
do a little bit
right?
of intelligence and a little bit of police.
Yeah.
So, yet they are doing a lot of intelligence work, but it's very easy to recognize them because who the hell else stands on the same street corner all day, or is parked in the same car all day? Of people, as they leave their houses. Who else is doing that all day, just sitting in one spot, dressed in civilian clothes, but taking pictures of people, like as they come outside of their houses, as they cross. Yeah. So anyway, these 2 guys in civilian clothes, they approach them and they demand to see ID. And so one of the guys, whose name was Ubaldo Herrera, he says, well, who are you? You have not identified yourself as a police officer. I'm not going to show you ID. I don't know who the hell you are. So they argued, Ubaldo and his friend Manuel argued with these 2 state security agents for a few minutes back and forth, and then the guys leave. And a little while later, so Ubaldo and Manuel, they go inside, they start having their book club meeting, and the book club was called Mises Cuba.
Right. We heard about this. We heard about this in Brazil.
Yeah, it was only 4 or 5 people, meeting in somebody's home, somebody's little house in Havana, having book club meetings, training themselves with new ideas. But by this way, they had organically become libertarians. I was very impressed. So anyway, some of the people involved had a long history of being dissidents, because the culture in Cuba, it's very similar to the culture in North Korea, where if your grandfather was a counter-revolutionary, then that means even 2 generations later, the government is watching you a lot closer than they're watching everybody else. So, and that's the way it was, because, somebody's grandfather was a counter-revolutionary, the government had always been watching people. So that's how they knew that they were having this book club meeting tonight. The police come back later, the 2 state security agents come back later with the revolutionary police. So these are the police wearing uniform. They arrest these 2 guys, they take them to jail. First, they get charged with attempted assault of a police officer. Then later, because that never happened, that charge got changed to distributing enemy propaganda. There is specifically a crime in the Cuban Penal Code called distributing enemy propaganda. which basically anything that criticizes socialism or talks about how great America is or just freedom in general, obviously anything that's going to be published by the Ludwig von Mises Institute is obviously going to be very anti-communist. So yeah, they got charged with distributing enemy propaganda. One of them, because he was considered the accessory but not the main criminal, he got sentenced to 1.5 years in prison. But the main guy, Ubaldo, who had some books with him, he had a stack of books in his arm, he got sentenced to 7 years.
7 years.
In a labor prison.
Labor
7
prison.
years in a labor prison.
Gulag.
For distributing enemy propaganda. Yeah, he got sent to the Gulag for having the wrong books.
Yeah. It's nice to know that Cuba still have gulags and forced labor in 21st century.
Even into the 21st century, they still have gulags. Absolutely.
They stopped shooting gays, right? But they still have gulags.
Yeah, they stopped shooting gays, and they officially execute a lot less people. But one of the reasons why it was so important for us to get the information out about these people is once the rest of the world starts reading about a certain prisoner, it becomes very difficult for the Cuban state to make him disappear. So we started putting out press releases and anything that we could do, and it was a small group of us, to
protect these guys against potentially being murdered, right?
To protect these guys against potentially being murdered, and also to document human rights abuses against the rest of the people in the Mises Cuba group. Now, the guy who hit me up on Facebook, who contacted me on Facebook, was the co-founder of the Mises Cuba book club. He had just gotten to Miami as a refugee because the regime had started beating him very severely, and he got to the level where state security started telling him, listen, if you keep doing this, you're going to die. So can you imagine the nationalists of your country, you off to the side, and literally, if you keep being a libertarian, we're going to kill you.
Yeah.
So this guy left the country.
I can see communists doing that.
When he was a political prisoner, I saw the photos of him after some of the beatings that he had received, and it was insane, man. They beat the shit out of him.
It's torture. It's torture.
With nightsticks. Like literally, there was broken, open flesh on his forehead, on top of his head, blood running down his face in stripes. It looked like a horror movie.
Shit.
Furthermore, I learned after talking with that guy and knowing him for a few months, that regime took something from his mind that he is never going to get back. He is permanently mentally ill. He is still pretty high functioning, but he is permanently mentally ill because of what the Cuban regime did to him.
Torture, basically,
so anyway, he had just gotten to Miami. He had just gotten to Miami in the beginning of 2017, and he still only spoke Spanish. So even though he was in the United States, he didn't know any libertarians he could go to for help. So he spent a couple of days just combing every Spanish-speaking Facebook libertarian group, looking for somebody who would pay attention to him, and then he found me posting. And really, I was shit posting. So that's how he started blowing me, and I started getting educated about the folks down there. And then I met them, we started talking with them, and then we built an international team to support them. So there was me in the United States. There was another gal, Mamela Fiallo, from Ecuador. There was another gal named Angelines from the Libertarian Spain. She's a very strong anarcho-capitalist. And then there was a few more other people who joined the cause. So we put together an international volunteer team. Before you know it, the more press that this little group starts getting, the more media attention they start getting from around the world. And we started picking up different libertarian blogs, podcasts. And then we started getting picked up by different Cuba news websites. Like there's a lot of diaspora news websites because there's Cubans all over the world. Cubans fled to countries all over the world to escape that regime. So there are Cuba-focused news websites all over the world reporting on these people. Well, that was really good because it made it impossible to kill these people. However, the regimes started arresting them a lot more. So I was talking with one of the other co-organizers of that organization, a wonderful gentleman by the name of Nelson Rodriguez Chartrand, co-founder of Visas Cuba, and he was saying, hey, since they're doing all of this and we're starting to get more attention internationally, and now we've recruited some people from the neighborhood to the movement, do we just keep this as a movement, or do we make a political party? And my opinion was, well, if they're going to do this crap to you, you might as well just full-on threaten them and declare yourself a political party. So 3 months later, in May of 2017, the Cuban Libertarian Party was born. Now, we're going to fast forward to a few months after that.
I saw the picture when they was founded, yeah.
So you saw the picture at the time?
Yeah, people posted on the, I think, Facebook.
That's
and
insane.
Yeah, we saw the picture when they founded the Libertarian Party and the Mises Institute, right?
Yeah, the Mises Mambi Institute of Cuba. So that is the think tank arm of the Cuban Libertarians. Part of what Mises Mambi does is they will publish news releases written by the Cubans in Cuba. Because, who better knows what's happening to them than them?
Sure.
So they write a lot of their own news releases. They send them to us in the U.S. We upload it to the website. But on top of that, the Mises Mambi volunteers in the United States work on translations of Ludwig von Mises, translations of things by Murray Rothbard. So we see what the different Spanish language Mises institutes around the world are doing, because we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We don't want to repeat unnecessary work. So we'll see what other people are doing, what they're working on. Luckily, there's so much libertarian literature that everybody can be working
even in
on
Spanish
completely different. Yeah, even in Spanish, everybody can be working on something completely different. So we look at what the other institutes are working on, and then we'll do something different. So there's a lot of articles that Rothbard wrote about Cuba. Way back when, so we've translated a few of those. There was one article where Rothbard even talked about Che Guevara and how he failed at some of the fundamental laws of guerrilla warfare, which was very fascinating. Most of the Spanish-speaking libertarian world has no idea that that article exists. So we translated that. There's a lot of cool stuff that's happening on Mises Mambi. So Mises Mambi focuses on libertarian thought and also news from Cuba. The Cuban Libertarian Party focuses on political activism, especially street activism. They do a lot of street activism. So a couple of months after the Cuban Libertarian Party is formed, I'm still learning about Cuba. I'm still studying. I'm still filling myself up with as much as I possibly can. And I found a lot of things that really surprised me. I did not know, after the Cuban Revolutionary War, which was the guerrilla war that brought Fidel Castro to power, Cuba had a much bigger civil war between all the people who fought against Batista, who are now fighting against Fidel. And a lot of people have no idea that this war ever happened. It was called the Escambray Rebellion. Let me give you just an idea of the scope. The guerrilla war that brought Fidel Castro to power was about 2.5 years long. Not even that long. It was like 2 years and 3 months. And soldiers and police that Batista was able to deploy against the guerrillas at any one time was 30,000 people. 30,000. So 2 years and 30,000 people fighting the guerrilleros. And Fidel never had more than 200 or 300 guys because there were other guerrillas. So Fidel was not even the only person fighting in that war. There were 5 or 6 other guerrillas, plus urban militias, plus student organizations that were doing suicide missions just to try and kill some government soldiers. Like, it was insane. And the history has been rewritten to give Fidel Castro and the communists credit for the Cuban Revolutionary War. No, he was just the best at public relations. Anyway, after Fidel Castro comes to power, 1 year after the rebel army comes rolling into Havana in 1959, 1 year later, a lot of his own veterans decide, forget this, this authoritarian regime is not what we are fighting for. We did not fight for them to be executing people around the clock. We did not fight for all these newspapers to be getting shut down. This is not the free Cuba that we were fighting for. So the guerrillas went back to the bush. Now, I told you guys, 2 years, 30,000 people. And Fidel never had more than a couple of hundred guys. There were about 2,000 guerrillas fighting against Fidel. So 10 times as many people as he recruited were fighting against his regime. And the Escambray Rebellion, this massive civil war, lasted for 6 years. 6 years. And in order to surround the guerrillas,
people don't know that in Brazil that Cuba had a civil war for 6 years after the revolution. People trying to impede Fidel Castro of becoming a dictator, but they failed.
And most of the people fighting, there were some Batistianos fighting against him. However, by that time, most Batistianos fled from the country because a couple of months later, so like April or May of 1959, sometime in the spring or the summer, the Batistianos tried a coup. They tried one last hurrah to get it together, and they failed. So all the last Batistianos in Cuba, they fled. The ones that did not get arrested and executed, they fled in 1959.
To U.S. probably,
yeah. Yes. So there were some Batistianos that fought against Fidel in the Civil War, but most of the people fighting against him were people from his own side, from the last war. And in order to crush the guerrillas, the communist regime created a national revolutionary militia because they had no army. They dissolved the old government army. And there was only a couple of thousand people in the new revolutionary army. So they created a national militia, and they just drafted people. They conscripted something like 300,000 people. 300,000
forcibly,
campesinos.
Forcibly.
Yeah, I mean, it was people with a gun showed up. It was a piece of paper and a gun. Congratulations, you're in the National Revolutionary Militia. You get to fight to protect the revolution. Now, come on, let's go. There's no choice. So by this time, the Soviet Union's military advisors had arrived in Cuba. And about 400 advisors were leading these troops strategically. So in all the different areas where there were guerrillas fighting, basically the Soviets, they did like the rural version of capturing Berlin. They would encircle an objective and just start sending human waves.
Yeah, attrition warfare.
The guerrillas would fight to the death. Yeah. So if there's a group with like 20 guerrilleros and they're hidden, they had the advantage, which is why the regime's casualties were so much more severe than the rebels, because these dudes had barely any military training, and literally it was like World War II, just long lines of people, walking forward with a gun, and it was the guerrillas just taking pot shots until they ran out of ammo or until they themselves got shot. And the regime didn't care about how many people it lost, because just like
they're all slaves, right? They're all slaves.
Yeah, if somebody
communism.
falls,
yeah,
the next guy goes forward and picks up his gun. So that's
Soviet style, yeah.
Annihilated this rebellion. Yeah, so there was this massive civil war that most people don't even know about. And this was one of the things that I learned. One of the other things that I learned while researching the Castro regime and how to oppose them through politics on the island, I figured out, or I learned, I did not figure out, I came to learn from information already available, that the Cuban armed forces invaded Venezuela and Nicaragua. And the main reasons why those communist regimes are still in power today in Venezuela and Nicaragua is because there are tens of thousands of Cuban soldiers in those countries, but they're dressed in the uniform of those countries. They're not wearing Cuban uniforms. And that's because they learned from my country's PR nightmare, all right? How many photos have people seen in the news of American soldiers in Iraq, American soldiers in Afghanistan, American soldiers in other countries? My country's militaries have very distinct, very easily recognizable uniform. So there's no question that you're looking at an American soldier in a picture, So no matter how good somebody's intentions are, when you have a soldier who is like patting down a civilian woman, in her neighborhood where she lives, searching for guns, it just doesn't look good. So the Cubans, they learn from that, which is why instead of Cubans over there in Cuban uniforms, the Cubans wear Venezuelan uniforms, and Nicaraguan uniforms, and other Cubans wear civilian clothes. The ones who are actual, like, doing military duties in Cuba, the number of those soldiers is somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000. And these numbers are coming from a report called Cubazuela, which is published by the Foundation for Human Rights in Cuba. So the estimate is between 30,000 and 40,000. But then there's another 30,000 Cuban doctors. Most people don't know that Cuban doctors are also soldiers. There is a Cuban law.
Yeah, we know that in Brazil, that they are agents. We know that. Yeah.
So not only that they're agents, because yes, all the doctors they're forced to work as intelligence agents.
They're slaves. Yeah, they're slaves.
They're soldiers. No. I'm saying they're soldiers. They are commissioned officers in the Cuban armed forces, because the Cuban law requires them to do basic military training between the 5th and 6th year of medical school. And completing your military training is a requirement, or else you cannot be a doctor in Cuba. So every single Cuban doctor that's in another country is a reserve military officer, and most of the world does not know that. So when people are talking about, oh, AMLO in Mexico is so great because he brought in 13,000 Cuban doctors, I said, oh my God, he brought in 13,000 Cuban soldiers to spy on his people, and most of them of whom are crappy doctors.
Oh yeah, they are fake doctors. We know that. They are like, they have some technical knowledge, but they're not fucking magical, real magics.
Now, what else do the doctors do other than collect intelligence? Because they are absolutely spies. On top of that, they get used to use medicine as a weapon, a political weapon. So if you are from one of the Chavista parties, it's not just the United Socialist Party. There's a whole list of political parties in Venezuela that are Chavista.
Right.
And they have
control position,
ask, right? Well, why would you have all these different parties if they're all Chavista and they're all on the same page? Well, do you only drink one single flavor of beer? There's all kinds of different interpretations of Marxism, but there's also different ideas for how to steal the money for themselves. Like every group has their own goals.
Sure.
Which is why, all right, so you guys have heard of the colectivos. These are Venezuelan paramilitaries, civilian paramilitaries, but they do get trained by the Cubans. There are colectivos who are hardcore, diehard Marxists. Like that is their religion. And then there are other colectivos that they're business. They got casinos. They don't actually believe in communism. They just knew which team they needed to join in order to get power and be in charge and become a warlord. So anyway, the more I was learning about what Cuba is doing, I found out what Cuba is doing to other people. When I found out that Cuba had invaded Venezuela, and I found out that there was a small and relatively new libertarian movement in Venezuela called Movimiento Libertario de Venezuela, I decided to contact them, and I started a dialogue with those folks, and I started offering them my services, and translating a lot of stuff to English for them, and also helping them with different information, digital information, books, guides on how to grow your own food, guides on how to purify your own water, just all kinds of information for how people can little by little become more independent from a communist government. Because one of the problems that Venezuela's libertarians were facing was if they wanted to go to the doctor, they either have to get somebody from abroad to send money to them so that they have money to go visit a private Venezuelan doctor, because most of the I don't know about most, but at least 25,000 doctors and nurses have left Venezuela because you just can't live in communism. You cannot live where there's hyper. You got to carry your money around in a goddamn bucket. There's crime everywhere. People are getting murdered left and right, robbed left and right. You can't even do your job in the hospital when there's no electricity for 7 hours a day. You know what I'm saying? So most of the doctors just left. So the few private doctors that are still there, they're charging. They're charging money because it's an economic law. There is a very short supply and a very high demand. So you either get somebody to send you money so you can go to one of the few Venezuelan doctors, or you get somebody to send you money so you can take a bus to